The doctor's voice on the phone was careful. Professional. The kind of careful that tells you something is wrong before the words do. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'm calling to confirm your appointment for the follow-up cognitive evaluation. Your family contacted us with some concerns, and we wanted to make sure you were comfortable with the referral." I stood in my kitchen holding a wooden spoon, a pot of soup simmering on the stove behind me. I had just finished labeling 12 jars of homemade tomato preserves in my neatest handwriting. I had just balanced my checking account to the penny. I had just finished reading the 3rd chapter of a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, which I was going to discuss at my book club on Thursday. I said, "I'm sorry, which family member contacted you?" There was a pause. "Your daughter-in-law," he said. "Serena Calloway. She said you'd been experiencing significant memory lapses. Confusion about dates. Getting lost in familiar places. She said the family was very worried." I set the wooden spoon down. Serena had told my son's doctor that I had dementia, not as a question, not as a concern she'd shared with me first, as a fact, a confirmed, reported, filed fact, without my knowledge, without my consent, and without a single word to my face. They had decided what I was, and they had done it quietly while I was still standing. What Serena didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment for 2 years. Not because I'm paranoid, not because I distrusted everyone around me, but because my husband Arthur had warned me, in his gentle and precise way, in the last letter he ever wrote me, that the people who want what you have will first try to convince you, and everyone else, that you no longer deserve to hold it. He knew something I hadn't seen yet. Inside the cedar box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet sat the truth that would unravel everything Serena had so carefully constructed. She had built a case. I had built a foundation. And there is a difference between the two that she was about to learn in the most permanent way possible. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people who know me well still call me Marge. I'm 71 years old. I have arthritis in my left hand that makes mornings difficult and cold weather unpleasant, but I have never once let it stop me from doing what needs doing. For 38 years I worked as a school librarian in a mid-sized public school in central Ohio. I cataloged, organized, repaired, and curated. I knew every book in that library by section, by author, by reading level, and in many cases, by the student who most needed it. I have matched a struggling 14-year-old boy with the right biography and watched him become a reader for life. I have introduced a shy girl to a novel that gave her words for feelings she didn't know how to name. I did this quietly, without fanfare, because that is what I do. I notice. I remember. I connect things that belong together. Arthur used to say that I was the most organized person he'd ever met, and he meant it as the highest compliment. He was a civil engineer. He appreciated precision. He appreciated a person who kept their word, kept their records, and kept their promises in order. We were well matched. He died 3 years ago, on a Wednesday morning in October, sitting in his favorite chair in the sunroom. The doctor said it was peaceful. I have to believe that because I was not in the room when it happened. I was in the kitchen making his coffee. That is the thing about loss that no one warns you about. It arrives in ordinary moments. You are doing something simple and ordinary and necessary, and the world changes without asking your permission. I grieved him fully and privately. I did not perform my grief. I did not post it or announce it or display it at gatherings. I simply lived inside it until the shape of my life adjusted around the space he had left. I kept the house. Our house. The one we built together in 1987 on a double lot in a quiet neighborhood that has since become considerably more valuable. We had paid it off by 1998. I had the deed, the title, the paid-in-full mortgage paperwork, and every property tax receipt going back to 1988 in a fireproof filing cabinet in the second bedroom. People who meet me sometimes make assumptions. I am a small woman. I have white hair. I keep in a practical cut. I wear reading glasses on a beaded chain around my neck. I drive a 2016 Buick that I keep immaculately clean. I bring food to neighbors when they are sick. I do not raise my voice. I do not speak harshly about people in public. These qualities are sometimes mistaken for softness. They are not softness. They are the habits of a woman who has spent 7 decades understanding that the people who shout the loudest are often the ones who have the least to stand on. I was raised to let the work speak, to let the records speak, to let time do what arguments cannot. My son Daniel got his father's height and his grandfather's laugh. He also got, I'm sorry to say, a tendency toward avoidance that neither Arthur nor I ever quite managed to correct. He married Serena 6 years ago. I tried. I genuinely tried. But some stories have to be told from the beginning before the end make sense. The cedar box was Arthur's idea, and I want you to understand that before I tell you what was inside it, because the idea itself says everything about the kind of man he was. He made it himself. Not assembled from a kit. Not ordered online. He built it in the garage over the course of 3 weekends in the spring of 2019, 14 months before he died. He was already sick by then, not critically, not obviously, but the cardiologist had been direct with both of us about the trajectory. Arthur took that directness and turned it into action, which was his nature. He did not sit and mourn what was coming. He sat in the garage and sanded cedar planks by hand. The box is 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep, and about 6 inches tall. He jointed the corners by hand, no nails. The lid has a small brass latch and a cedar-lined interior that still, even now, releases a faint warm smell when I open it. He burned our initials into the lid, M.A. in a small oval, just above the latch. He was not a sentimental man by display, but he was deeply sentimental by action. He put the box on my vanity on a Sunday morning and said, "This is for the things that matter when I can't speak for them anymore." I didn't understand the full weight of that sentence until later. Over the following weeks, he began placing things inside. His method was careful and deliberate. He included a handwritten letter to me, 12 pages front and back, in his engineer's block print, that I have read so many times the paper has softened at the folds. He wrote about the house, about Daniel, about his wishes. He wrote about the garden and who should have the roses if I ever decided to move. He wrote about money with the specificity of a man who had always understood that financial clarity is a form of love. He also included, tucked into a sealed envelope with my name written on the front, a second letter addressed to Daniel. This one was shorter. 4 pages. I have never read it. He asked me not to, and I haven't. But he told me what it contained in general terms. It was about responsibility. About the difference between loving someone and protecting them. About what it means to be the man left standing after a father is gone. He placed inside the box a folded copy of the deed to our home, annotated in his handwriting. He placed inside a copy of his updated will, which we had redone 6 months before his death with our family attorney, a woman named Patricia Hess who has handled our affairs for 20 years. He placed inside a notarized letter of instruction that he and Patricia had prepared together, specifying that in the event of his death, the house was to remain in my sole name without contest, and that upon my death, the property would transfer directly to our granddaughter Lily, Daniel's daughter from his first relationship, whom Arthur and I had raised for 3 years while Daniel got his life together. Lily was 11 now. The house was hers in the future, with a trust structure that would prevent any interference. And then Arthur had placed one more thing inside the box. Something I hadn't asked him to include, but which I understood immediately when I saw it. It was a letter from our family physician, Dr. Raymond Okafor, dated November 2019. The letter confirmed that Margaret and Calloway had completed a baseline cognitive evaluation and scored well within normal range across all tested domains: attention, memory, processing speed, executive function. Dr. Okafor had written, in his precise and careful language, that Mrs. Calloway showed no signs of cognitive impairment and that he would be conducting annual evaluations at her request to maintain an ongoing record of cognitive health. It was Arthur's idea. He had thought of it not because he doubted me, but because he doubted the world around me. He knew that a widow with a valuable property and a grown son with a complicated marriage was a certain kind of target. He was an engineer. He planned for structural failure before the structure was built. He looked at what we had, a house, a granddaughter, a future, and he asked himself who might one day try to redirect it. And then he asked Dr. Okafor to help me protect against it. We had continued those annual evaluations every year since. I had passed each one with a clear record. Dr. Okafor kept copies. I kept copies. The most recent one from 8 months ago was in the cedar box. Now I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone, listening to a doctor who had received a call from Serena Calloway expressing grave concern about my declining mental state. And I thought about that cedar box. I thought about Arthur's handwriting in the corner of the deed. I thought about the 12 pages he had written on a Sunday morning in the spring of 2019 and what he had said near the end of that letter. If someone tells you that you are less than you are, do not argue with them. Simply open the box. I thanked the doctor politely. I told him I would follow up soon. And then I hung up and stood very still in my kitchen for a long moment, listening to the soup simmer, and I thought about how much Arthur had understood about the world, and how right he had been. Serena Calloway is not a stupid woman. I want to say that plainly because the easiest thing to do with someone who has hurt you is to make them small in the telling. I won't do that. It wouldn't be honest, and it wouldn't explain how she managed to get as far as she did. She is intelligent, organized, socially aware, and deeply motivated. These are qualities I might have admired in a different context. The problem is what she has organized her intelligence around. Serena is motivated by image, by acquisition, and by the particular kind of social anxiety that comes from having grown up without money and spending her adult life determined that no one would ever be able to tell. She grew up in a small apartment with a single mother and one pair of good shoes that she kept polished. I know this because Daniel told me, and because I could see it in her, the way her eyes moved around a room, clocking surfaces, assessing values, cataloging what things cost. There was nothing casual about Serena's attention to objects. A thrift store lamp offended her. A non-brand name bag made her visibly uncomfortable. She had constructed an aesthetic life. Their home was photographed, curated, staged even in its daily version, and she protected that construction with the energy of someone who feared it could be dismantled at any moment. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was strategic. Daniel fell in love with her competence. He has always been drawn to people who know exactly what they want. He spent his 20s drifting, 3 different majors in college, 2 false starts in careers, the relationship that produced Lily that he wasn't ready for. Arthur and I raised Lily for 3 years while Daniel reassembled himself. We did not resent that. We loved Lily. We love Lily. But Daniel knew, in the way that people know the things they cannot quite admit, that he had failed early and been caught by his parents' steadiness. When he met Serena, he met someone who seemed incapable of that kind of drifting. She seemed solid.
Certain.
He transferred the weight he should have found in himself onto her certainty, and she accepted it, and that arrangement worked well enough until there was something to disagree about. The thing they disagreed about, without ever quite naming it, was me. From the beginning, Serena saw my house the way she saw everything, as a resource to be assessed and positioned. She came to Sunday dinners and walked through rooms with her eyes doing their quiet math. She asked questions about the property taxes, the size of the lot, what the neighbors' houses had sold for. She did this without embarrassment because I don't think she understood that it was observable. She thought she was being practical. She began suggesting, about a year into their marriage, that Daniel and I should talk about planning for the future. That phrase, in Serena's vocabulary, meant one thing: what would happen to the house? She floated ideas. An in-law suite. An investment opportunity. Whether I had considered downsizing into something more manageable. Each suggestion was framed in the language of concern. We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Margaret. Each one pointed in the same direction. I listened. I noted. I said I was fine, thank you, and redirected the conversation. She escalated slowly. First it was questions about my health. You mentioned you forgot that appointment, didn't you? Is that happening a lot? I hadn't mentioned forgetting any appointment. I remembered every appointment. But she said it with such casual certainty that for a moment I second-guessed myself, and that second-guessing, that tiny flicker of self-doubt, was exactly what she was cultivating. She began saying things to Daniel that he later repeated to me, usually gently, as questions. Did I want to start writing things down more? Had I thought about whether the stairs were going to be difficult eventually? Was I still comfortable managing my own finances? Each question was reasonable on its surface. None of them, in the context of my actual life and actual health, had any basis. Daniel did not challenge her. This is the thing about Daniel that still costs me sleep on certain nights. He is not a bad person. He is a person who has learned to buy peace at the price of truth, and that habit is so deeply ingrained in him that he mistakes it for harmony. He would hear Serena express a concern about me, and instead of asking me directly, instead of sitting down with me and having the honest conversation a son owes his mother, he would let the concern float. He would avoid. He would say nothing, and his silence became permission. The only person in that house who saw me clearly was Lily. Lily, at 11, would come to my house on Saturday mornings and we would bake together or read together or walk around the garden, and she would ask me questions that proved her mind was alive and curious and real. She once asked me what the most important thing I'd ever learned was, and I told her it was the difference between things that look valuable and things that are. She had thought about that for a long moment and then said, like, how a library card is worth more than a lot of things that cost money. I nearly cried. This child who was being raised in a house where worth was measured by what could be photographed, had somehow understood the thing her father had not. She was who I was protecting. She was who Arthur had been protecting. And Serena, I think, had begun to understand that. The call from the doctor came in early March, but the story that led to it had built over the previous 6 months, and the moment I need to tell you about, the one that preceded the call and made the call possible, happened at Christmas. Daniel and Serena hosted Christmas that year. It was the first time they had taken over the holiday for me. Serena had been angling toward it for 2 years, and I had finally agreed because Daniel had asked me sincerely, and because I thought perhaps a different venue would ease some of the tension I had been quietly feeling. I told myself it would be generous. I told myself it was a gift to them. I should have trusted the instinct that told me otherwise. I baked for 3 days before Christmas dinner. Not because I had to, there would be catered food, Serena had arranged all of that, but because it was what I did. It was what Arthur's mother had taught me, what my own mother had done before her, and what I had done every December for 43 years. Baking was not a task in my family. It was a language. I made a Yule log. I made Arthur's mother's almond crescents, which require patience and specific technique. I made a cranberry walnut bread that had been in my recipe collection since 1981. I packed everything carefully into tins that I wrapped with cloth ribbon, not cellophane, not plastic, cloth ribbon that could be pressed and saved and used again. It was a small thing, but it was mine. I also brought the cedar box. I want to explain why I brought it. It was not planned. I had been meaning for several weeks to speak with Daniel privately about some of the estate documents Arthur had prepared. Updates that Patricia Hess had recommended I review with Daniel in person, not because anything was changing, but because Daniel deserved to know what had been arranged and why. I thought Christmas might present a moment. I thought, foolishly, that holiday goodwill might make space for a real conversation. I put the box in the trunk of my Buick beneath a folded blanket, intending to find a quiet minute with Daniel at some point in the evening. I drove to their house through a light snowfall. Their neighborhood had the particular kind of well-maintained beauty that is meant to be observed from a car window: symmetrical houses, identical holiday lights, coordinated wreaths. Their home was lit warmly from within, and through the front window I could see the tree, which was white-flocked and decorated entirely in gold and cream. It was beautiful, objectively. It looked like a set. I carried my tins to the door with my good hand and rang the bell, and Serena answered wearing a deep green dress and the serene expression she always wore when she had organized something to her satisfaction. Margaret, she said, with a smile that reached approximately to her cheekbones. You look cold.
Come in.
The house smelled of catered food, good food, restaurant quality, presented on serving dishes that I recognized from a high-end home store. The table was set with the precision of a magazine spread. There were little printed menu cards at each place. Serena had thought of everything. She always thought of everything. My daughter-in-law Renata was there, Daniel's sister, and her husband Joe. My neighbor Helen, who is close to the family, was not there, but Serena's college friends Claire and Brent were, along with Brent's parents, who I was meeting for the first time. And Lily, my Lily, was there in a red dress that made her look older than 11, sitting on the love seat near the window with a book in her lap until she saw me and lit up in the way she always did. Grandma Marge, she said, and crossed the room, and I held her for a moment longer than was probably polite. The dinner table conversation moved in the way it always did when Serena was hosting, efficiently, fashionably, never touching anything uncomfortable. People discussed travel plans and home renovations and a restaurant that had opened downtown. I contributed where I could. I asked Brent's parents about their background. I listened. I was present. After dinner, as people settled into the living room with dessert, I brought out my tins. I had made 3 of them. 1 for Daniel and Serena. 1 for Lily, with a card. 1 for Daniel's sister Renata, who I knew appreciated homemade things. I set them on the kitchen island and began to explain what each one contained. That was when it happened. Serena came into the kitchen as I was opening the first tin to show Lily the almond crescents, which Lily had always loved. Serena looked at the tin, then at the others, and something crossed her face that she controlled very quickly, but not quickly enough.
Oh, she said.
You brought baked goods. The way she said it, the specific tone. It wasn't quite dismissal, and wasn't quite surprise. It was the tone of someone encountering something they had expected to have to manage. I always bring baked goods at Christmas, I said. I kept my voice easy. I smiled at Lily, who was already reaching for a crescent. Of course, Serena said. Then, to Lily, we have the dessert tray in the dining room, sweetheart, the one from Morel's. You should save room. Lily pulled her hand back. She looked at me. I shook my head slightly. Don't worry, it's fine. Serena began to close the tins. I'll just put these in the refrigerator, so they keep, she said. They don't need refrigeration, I said. They're fine at room temperature. I'd feel better knowing they're safe, she said, and she picked up 2 of the tins and moved toward the refrigerator, and Claire, her friend Claire, was watching from the doorway with that specific expression people wear when they've witnessed something they don't want to have to respond to. Daniel was in the living room. He had not come into the kitchen. It might have ended there. I might have let it go, tucked it into the folder of small humiliations that you collect over years of navigating difficult relationships. But then Brent's mother, a well-meaning woman named Harriet who simply had no way of knowing, asked what was in the tins, and Serena answered before I could. Margaret brought some things she made, Serena said, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. She loves to bake. It's sweet. Sweet. Like I was a child who had colored a picture. Harriet looked at me with genuine warmth. Homemade things are always lovely. She does it every year, Serena said. Then she paused and she added, and this is the moment I want you to hold, because this is where the temperature in the room dropped without anyone quite naming why, she added. We've been a little worried about her, actually. She gets confused sometimes. Forgets things. It's hard to watch, you know? Daniel is wonderful with her. The kitchen went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true and something false have been laid in the same sentence, and no one is certain which is which. Harriet looked at me with different eyes now. Adjusted eyes. Claire looked at her glass. Serena moved to the refrigerator. And I stood at the kitchen island in my son's house, next to 3 tins of food I had spent 3 days making, next to my granddaughter, who had gone very still beside me, and I absorbed what had just happened. She had not shouted it. She had not accused me. She had simply placed the idea, gently, socially, with the particular skill of someone who knows that the most effective lies sound like concern, into a room full of people who had no reason to doubt her. She had given me a diagnosis in passing at a dinner party as a footnote to a conversation about baked goods. I looked at Daniel. He was standing in the doorway now. He had heard. I could see by his face that he had heard. He held his glass of wine, and he looked at me for one long, complicated second. And he said nothing. He turned back to the living room. That silence, that turning away, was the real injury, not Serena's words. Serena's words were what I expected from Serena, once I understood who she was. Daniel's silence was something else. Daniel's silence was the proof of something I had been refusing to name. I looked at Lily. She was 11 years old, and she was looking at me with eyes that held a fury she didn't have language for yet. Her jaw was tight. She reached over and took an almond crescent from the open tin and ate it, deliberately, with her eyes on her stepmother's back. It was the most dignified act of loyalty I witnessed that year, and it was performed by a child. I closed the tin gently. "They're lovely," I said to no one in particular, with a voice so steady I surprised myself. "I hope you enjoy them." I excused myself to use the restroom. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in Serena's beautifully tiled guest bathroom, and I held my hands in my lap, my arthritic left hand inside my right, and I breathed the way Arthur had taught me to breathe when I was angry. Slowly. All the way down. Let it settle. The box was in my trunk. My annual cognitive evaluation from 8 months ago was in the box. And somewhere in that house, Serena was refilling people's glasses and playing the gracious host, entirely confident that she had said something unremarkable. Something that would settle into the consciousness of the room and stay there quietly, growing, waiting to be useful. She had no idea that she had just shown me the exact shape of what she was planning. She had no idea what I had in my trunk. She had no idea that my husband had anticipated her, had anticipated someone like her, 14 months before he died, standing in a garage sanding cedar by hand. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and looked at myself in the mirror. "Open the box," Arthur had said. "Not yet, but soon." I drove home through the snow that night, and I did not cry until I turned onto my own street. I am telling you this not because crying matters or doesn't matter, but because I want to be honest about the order of things. I held myself together for the drive, and then I arrived at my home, the one Arthur and I built, and I pulled into the driveway, and the headlights swept across the front door, and something in me released. Not collapse. Not breakdown. Just release. The way a pressure valve opens, not explosively, but necessarily. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes. I went inside, and I made tea because that is what I do, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the evening. Not the professional insult of Serena's maneuvering. Not even the fear of what she might be building toward. What I felt, underneath all of it, was grief. Because what had been insulted tonight was not just me. What had been insulted was every morning I had gotten up and mixed flour and butter and pressed it into shapes with hands that ached because I wanted the people I loved to have something real. What had been insulted was Arthur's mother, who had pressed those same shapes 60 years before me and who had died believing that things made by hand carried something that purchased things could not. What had been insulted was the language my family had spoken for generations, and Serena had called that language sweet, a word that means small, means harmless, means easily set aside. My left hand rested on the table. The arthritis had been bothering me all evening, cold weather, tension. I looked at it for a while. This hand had shaken children's hands over book recommendations for 38 years. This hand had held Arthur's hand in a hospital room at the end of October 3 years ago. This hand had beaten batter and turned pages and signed documents and kept records and planted bulbs and pressed letters into cedar-scented envelopes. It was not a weak hand. I thought about Daniel. This is the grief I cannot fully speak without it costing me something, even now. I thought about the boy I had raised, a boy who had struggled and stumbled and been caught and held and believed in, sometimes against considerable evidence. I thought about the 3 years Arthur and I had raised Lily so that Daniel could find his footing. I thought about every phone call I had answered at any hour, every silence I had sat in with him, every time I had not said what I was thinking because what he needed in that moment was not honesty, but steadiness. I thought about all of that, and I thought about him standing in the doorway with his wine glass, looking at me for one long second, and then turning away. And I thought, he is not a bad person. He is a person who has made himself small in the service of someone else's certainty. And that is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one.
I sat with that for a while.
Then something shifted. It is hard to describe exactly. It is the difference between grief and purpose, the moment when the pain stops being something that is happening to you and becomes something you can use. I thought about the cedar box in my trunk. I thought about Dr. Okafor's voice on the phone 2 weeks earlier, asking to confirm an appointment I had never agreed to. I thought about what Arthur had written. Simply open the box. I was ready to open it. Not that night. There were things to do first.
People to call.
A plan to be precise about. Arthur had been an engineer, and I had been married to him for 44 years, and I had learned from him that the difference between a good plan and a poor one is almost always in the sequencing. I washed my cup. I went upstairs. I slept. Daniel called me on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Christmas. I knew when I saw his name on the phone that something had shifted, because Daniel does not call on Tuesdays. He calls on Sundays at predictable intervals, in the way that people call when they are managing a relationship rather than living inside one. I answered.
Mom.
He sounded different.
Tighter.
Daniel.
I need to talk to you about something.
A pause. Do you remember me telling you about the azaleas 3 times? Silence. Daniel. I don't want to make this into a thing.
It is already a thing, I said.
Someone called my doctor and made a report about my cognitive health without telling me. That is not a worry. That is an action. Those are different. More silence. And then, in a voice I recognized from when he was 9 years old and had broken something and needed to confess it, she's worried about the house, Mom. She thinks it would be better if things were clearer. For everyone. There it was. For everyone. Which meant for Serena. Which meant she had been looking at my house, looking at its value, its deed, its future, and had decided that my cognitive decline would be a useful accelerant for the conversation she wanted to have about it. I felt the anger, and I let it pass through me without speaking. Daniel, I said, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly.
Okay.
Do you think I have dementia? A very long silence. Long enough that I heard him breathe twice. No, he said finally. No, I don't. Then why, I said, did you let her file a concern with my doctor without talking to me first? Why did your wife speak to my physician before your wife spoke to me? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the answer was what it always was with Daniel. He had let it happen because stopping it would have required a confrontation he didn't have the spine for. I love you, I said. And you have failed me in this. I want you to sit with that before we speak again. I ended the call. He called back twice that evening. I did not answer. Not because I was punishing him, but because I needed the space to complete what I was doing, and I could not do it with his guilt pulling at the edges. He needed to feel the weight of what he'd allowed. Not forever, but fully, at least once. I opened the cedar box that night. I read Arthur's letter. Not all of it. I never read all of it in one sitting, but the parts about Daniel. About what Arthur had feared for him. About the specific danger of a man who confused keeping peace with keeping faith. He loves you, Arthur had written. But love without courage is just sentiment. Help him find the difference. Be patient. But be clear. I was about to be both. Patricia has agreed to see me on a Thursday morning, which is when she keeps her standing appointment hours for long-term clients. I had known Patricia for 22 years. She had drafted Arthur's first will, overseen its revisions, and helped us build the trust structure for Lily's future with the same attention she gave everything, thorough, plain-spoken, without performance. I brought the cedar box. I set it on her desk and opened it, and I laid the documents out in the order Arthur had placed them. Patricia examined each one without rushing. She put on her reading glasses and read the trust language for Lily's inheritance. She confirmed the notarized letter of instruction. She checked the deed annotation against the current property record she pulled on her screen.
This is all in order, she said.
I know, I said. But I want to understand what it would take for any of this to be altered. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. Margaret, has someone tried to alter it? I told her everything. The dinner. Serena's comment. Dr. Okafor's call. Daniel's confession on the phone. The report to the doctor's office that had been filed without my knowledge or consent. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, a third-party cognitive concern reported to a physician is not a legal instrument. It doesn't change a deed. It doesn't touch a trust. It can't be used to challenge competency without a formal legal process, and that process requires medical documentation, a petition, and a court proceeding. Which she doesn't have, I said. Which she doesn't have, Patricia confirmed. And given that your annual evaluations are documented, clean, and on file with Dr. Okafor, any attempt to establish cognitive impairment would run directly into that record. So what was she doing?
I said.
Patricia folded her hands. Setting the stage. Building a narrative. If she can establish socially in your family's consciousness that you are not entirely reliable, she creates conditions for a later conversation about capacity. About who should be making decisions. About the house. She was building a reputation, I said. She was building a reputation, Patricia said. I looked at the cedar box. At the initials Arthur had burned into the lid.
M.A.
What do I do now?
I asked.
Patricia was precise. She told me that I had several options and walked me through each one. I could do nothing legal immediately, since no legal action had been taken against me. I could document everything, dates, witnesses, what was said and where. I could send Serena a cease and desist regarding any further contact with my medical providers. I could call Dr. Okafor and formally clarify the situation, ensuring my record remained uncontaminated. I could update my estate documents to add an explicit competency clause with annual review. We did 3 of those things that day. Patricia drafted a letter to Dr. Okafor's office. She drafted a document update. She added language to the trust that specified Lily's status was unchanged and unchangeable regardless of any third-party claim regarding the grantor's capacity, so long as the annual cognitive evaluations remained clear. I signed everything with my right hand while my left hand rested in my lap. When I left Patricia's office, I sat in my car for a moment with the cedar box on the passenger seat. I placed my hand on the lid, on the M.A. He had built this. He had sanded the wood by hand and burned the initials and placed every document with intention. He had known. He had seen the shape of the future, and he had built something that could hold against it. I started the car. I had one more call to make. I called Dr. Okafor directly the following morning. I had been his patient for 16 years, and he had been Arthur's physician before that, and he answered my call with the warmth of someone who understood that this was not a routine conversation. I explained what I knew. I was clear and factual. I told him that a family member had contacted his office without my knowledge or consent to report concerns about my cognitive health that were not based on any observed events. I told him that I believed this report was made with a purpose that was not related to my well-being. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Margaret, when I called you to schedule the follow-up, I was following protocol based on the concern as reported. But I want you to know that I have your full evaluation history, and nothing in that history indicated any need for concern. The referral was an administrative response, not a clinical judgment. I understand, I said. I want to make sure my record reflects that I contacted you directly to clarify and that I am requesting this referral be formally closed without a follow-up appointment.
Of course, he said.
I'll note it. And I would like to schedule my next annual evaluation for next month rather than the fall, if that's possible.
I'll have the front desk call you, he said.
And then, carefully, he added, Margaret. If you have concerns about the source of this report, there are steps available to you. I know, I said. I'm taking them. I spent the next several days writing things down. Not from uncertainty, my memory was fine, as it had always been, but because Arthur had taught me that the difference between truth and testimony is documentation. I wrote down the date of the Christmas dinner. I wrote down the words Serena had used, as precisely as I could recall them. I wrote down the names of everyone in the room. I wrote down Daniel's call, and the words she's worried about the house, Mom, and the silence that had preceded it. I called Daniel's sister Renata. Renata and I have always understood each other. She is 5 years older than Daniel, practical and clear-eyed, and she had never particularly liked Serena but had not involved herself in her brother's marriage out of respect for his choices. I told her what had happened. I told her about the doctor's call, about the dinner, about what Daniel had said on the phone. I told her about the cedar box, and what Patricia Hess had confirmed. Renata was quiet through all of it. Then she said, "What do you want to do, Mom?" I told her. I did not want chaos. I did not want a scene that would scar Lily, or cost Daniel a marriage he might still salvage. I did not want to post anything or broadcast anything or perform any version of justice in a way that would be about me rather than about the truth. What I wanted was for everyone who needed to understand what had happened to understand it, fully, clearly, and without the ability to misremember it later. I wanted a family meeting, not a confrontation. A meeting. The kind where documents are present and voices are level and the truth is placed on the table with the same precision that Arthur had placed documents in a cedar box. Renata said she would arrange it. We decided on a Sunday afternoon at Renata's house, neutral ground. Renata would invite Daniel. I would arrive with the cedar box and with a copy of Patricia's documentation. We would not ambush Serena. Renata would tell Daniel that there were estate matters that needed to be discussed as a family and that Serena's presence was expected. I did not call Daniel in advance. I let Renata manage that. I spent the intervening week in my ordinary life. I attended book club. I had lunch with my neighbor Helen. I called Lily, who was staying with her mother that week, and we talked for 40 minutes about the book she was reading. She was fine. She was bright and whole and fine. Whatever Serena was building, she had not gotten to Lily. That mattered more than anything else. On Saturday night, I pressed my good blouse. I took the cedar box from the shelf and set it on my dresser. I reviewed the documents in order. I read, again, the line in Arthur's letter that I always return to before something difficult. You have never needed anyone's permission to know your own worth. Act accordingly. I slept well. Better than I had in months. Renata's house is warm and slightly cluttered in the way of houses where people actually live. Stacks of books on end tables, a garden visible through the kitchen window, a smell of coffee that had been running since morning. It is the opposite of Daniel and Serena's house, and I have always loved it for that. I arrived 15 minutes early, which is my habit. Renata met me at the door, took the cedar box from my arms, and hugged me in the particular way she has, quickly, firmly, without comment. We set the box on the dining table. We arranged 3 chairs. I placed the documents in the order I would need them. Patricia's letter first, then the trust summary, then the annotated deed, then Dr. Okafor's cognitive evaluation from 8 months ago, then the formal record of my contact with his office clarifying the unauthorized referral. I made no speeches in advance. We drank coffee and talked about the garden. Daniel and Serena arrived together, which I had expected. Serena was wearing the expression she wore when she had been told something was important and had decided to manage it. Composed. Slightly elevated. She greeted me with a kiss near my cheek and said I looked well. Daniel kissed me on the top of my head, an old habit, and did not quite meet my eyes. We sat. Serena looked at the cedar box and then looked away, which told me she recognized it. She had seen it before in my house. She had once asked me what was in it, and I had said, private papers, and she had accepted that in the way she accepted things she intended to revisit later. Thank you both for coming, Renata said. She did not make it a social occasion. Renata is good at being direct without being aggressive. Mom has some things she wants to share about Arthur's estate arrangements, and there's something else she needs to address directly. We wanted to do it together as a family. Serena's smile shifted by approximately 2%. A professional would call it microexpression. I am not a professional, but I have been watching people for 71 years. Of course, Serena said. We're family. The word landed in the room and asked nothing of the air. I placed both hands on the table and looked at my son. He looked back at me this time. Something in his face was different from Christmas. Not resolved, not guilty exactly, but present. He was actually here, behind his eyes, in a way he had not been at that dinner table. I thought, good. He would need to be present for this. I thought about Arthur in the garage, sanding wood by hand in the spring, 14 months before he died. I thought about the 12 pages written in his block print, and about the sealed letter addressed to Daniel that I had never read, sitting in the bottom of the box. I thought about Dr. Okafor's careful voice on the phone. I thought about Lily eating an almond crescent in deliberate solidarity while her stepmother's back was turned. I thought about what I had spent 44 years becoming, what I had spent a lifetime building and protecting and keeping in order. I opened the cedar box. I did not open it dramatically. I simply unlatched it, the way you open something you have opened many times before, and the faint cedar smell rose into the room, and I began to lay the documents out on the table in the order I had arranged them. I want to begin, I said, with a phone call I received in early March. I described the call from Dr. Okafor's office. I described it factually, date, time, what was said, who had initiated the referral. I watched Serena's face as I spoke. She was very good. She held her expression, but her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her, pressed slightly tighter together. A concern was filed with my physician, I said, by someone claiming I was experiencing significant memory lapses and confusion. This was done without my knowledge and without any conversation with me. I slid the first document across the table. It was Patricia's letter, which referenced the unauthorized contact and my subsequent formal clarification with Dr. Okafor's office. I also want to share this, I said, and I slid the cognitive evaluation across the table. 8 months old. Dr. Okafor's signature at the bottom. Every domain normal. No indication of impairment. A clear baseline. I have had this evaluation annually since 2019. Arthur arranged it. This is the most recent. Daniel picked it up. He read it slowly. Serena said, carefully, Margaret, I only made that call because I was worried about you. I saw things that concern me. What things?
I said.
I kept my voice level. Tell me specifically. A pause. You left the stove on.
I have never left a stove on, I said.
Not at my house and not at yours. I've never been to your house without Daniel present, and he told me on the phone that he doesn't remember me repeating anything 3 times. So, I'd like you to be specific about what you observed. The room was very quiet. I was concerned, she said again. You filed a report with my doctor, I said. That is not the action of someone who is concerned. That is the action of someone who is building something. I watched her eyes move to Daniel. He did not give her anything. The estate documents, I said, and I slid the trust summary across the table, are in order. Arthur had them prepared with Patricia Hess in 2019, reviewed and updated in 2021, and confirmed complete at my meeting with Patricia last month. The house is in my name, and upon my death, it transfers in trust to Lily. Directly to Lily. With a trust structure that prevents any third-party claim or challenge. I paused. Regardless of any assertion made about my cognitive capacity, I said. That language was added specifically to the trust document at Arthur's direction. He anticipated that someone might one day try to challenge my ability to manage my own affairs in order to redirect assets. He protected against it. In writing, with a notary and an attorney. The silence now was a different kind. Not awkward. Structural. Like the silence after something shifts and cannot be unshifted. Serena said, and her voice had lost some of its management. I never said anything about the house. You said to Daniel that she was worried about the house, Mom, Renata said from across the table. His words. He told Mom on the phone. Daniel looked at his plate. He nodded once. I did say that. Serena turned to him. Daniel.
It's what you told me, he said.
Quietly, but clearly. You said something would need to be figured out with the house eventually. That it would be better if things were cleaner. It was the bravest sentence I had heard from my son in years. It cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway. I noted that. I want to read you something, I said. I took out the letter. Not the sealed letter to Daniel. I left that untouched. This was a portion of Arthur's letter to me, which I had marked with a small strip of paper. I read it aloud. The house is yours because you built it with me, not because I left it to you. There is a difference. A thing given can be taken. A thing built together belongs differently. If anyone tells you otherwise, if anyone tries to diminish what you own and what you've earned, show them the records.
Don't argue. Don't explain.
Show them the records, and then show them the door. I folded the letter. I placed it back in the box. I am not showing anyone the door today, I said, because that is not who I am, and it is not what this is about. But I want everyone in this room to understand completely, with no ambiguity, what was done, and what it could have led to if I had been less prepared. A report was filed with my doctor suggesting I was cognitively impaired. I am not. The documentation proving that exists and will continue to be maintained. The estate arrangements protecting Lily's future are legal, notarized, and explicitly protected against challenge. And any further contact with my medical providers by anyone other than myself will be addressed through Patricia Hess's office. I looked at Serena. I wanted you to be here, I said, because I believe you deserve to hear this directly. Not from Daniel, not from Renata. From me. I am not confused. I am not declining. I am a 71-year-old woman with arthritis in one hand and a fully functioning mind, and I have spent my life building something worth protecting. I intend to keep doing exactly that. No one spoke for a moment. Then Daniel said, Mom,
I'm sorry.
2 words. I received them. They were not enough, they were not nearly enough, but they were real, and I accepted them at face value. I know, I said. I waited until the following week to give Daniel his letter. I drove to his office, not to their house, to his office, and I left the sealed envelope with his assistant with a note. From your father. Open it alone. He called me that evening. He was crying, which he did not apologize for, and I did not minimize. He told me what the letter said because he wanted me to know. Arthur had written it in the way he wrote all things, plainly, without decoration. He had told Daniel that he was proud of him, which Daniel needed to hear from his father's pen. He had written about Lily, about who she was and what she deserved, and what it meant to protect someone who could not yet protect themselves.
He had written about me.
About what kind of woman I was, and what a man owed a woman like that. And then he had written this, which Daniel read to me over the phone, his voice unsteady. You will be the last person standing between your mother and the world for a while. I know that's hard for you. I know you don't always know what to do when things get complicated. So I'm going to tell you, when it gets complicated, ask yourself what I would have done. I would have stood next to her, not in front of her. She doesn't need that. Not behind her. She deserves better. Next to her. That's where you belong. Don't let anything or anyone move you from that spot. Not comfort. Not conflict avoidance. Not love for someone else. She built her whole life around being worthy of loyalty. Give her yours. Daniel was quiet after he read it. I was quiet too. I didn't, he said finally. I didn't stand next to you.
No, I said. You didn't.
Another silence. I'm going to try to now, he said. I told him I would hold him to that. Gently but firmly. The way Arthur would have. The cedar box sat on my nightstand that night. I left it open. The cedar smell warming the room slightly, the documents resting inside in their careful order. I thought about a man sanding wood in a garage in spring, working methodically, building something to last. Building it knowing he would not be there to see what it withstood.
He had been there anyway.
He was still there. That is the thing about love built with intention. It doesn't end when the person does. It continues in the structure it created. In the document. In the letter. In the cedar-lined interior of a box with 2 initials burned into the lid. M.A. The boundaries I set in the weeks that followed were not punitive.
I want to be clear about that.
I was not trying to end a marriage or exile a son. I was simply, finally, being precise about what I would and would not accept. The first term was simple: no further contact with any of my medical providers. Patricia Hess had drafted a formal letter to that effect. It was not threatening. It was informational. It stated clearly that my medical decisions were mine alone, that I had legal decision-making capacity established by ongoing evaluation, and that any third-party contact regarding my cognitive or physical health would be treated as a violation of medical privacy guidelines. The letter was addressed to Serena. A copy went to Daniel. The second term was about Lily. I had always had an independent relationship with my granddaughter, and I wanted it formalized in my own records. I called Lily's mother, a woman named Angela whom I have always respected, and I explained, as clearly as I could without involving Lily in adult complications, that I wanted Lily to continue to have direct access to me, and that I would be maintaining a standing Saturday visit as long as Lily wanted it. Angela agreed. She told me, her own reservations about certain dynamics in Daniel's household. We left it at that. The third term was about Daniel himself, and it was not a legal term, it was a personal one. I told him, on the phone, that I loved him without reservation, but that I would no longer be available as a resource that he could manage from a distance. If he wanted a relationship with me, he needed to show up for it. Not on Serena's schedule. Not in the careful half-presence he had perfected. Actually show up. Sunday calls were fine, but they were not a substitute for being present when something required him to take a position. He said he understood. I told him I would know whether he understood by watching, not by listening.
He accepted that.
As for Serena, I did not demand an apology because I did not want a performance of regret from someone who was still, at the time, processing the loss of a strategy she had spent considerable effort building. An apology under those conditions is not an apology. It is a tactical retreat. I told Daniel that if Serena wanted to speak with me directly at some point, I would be available for that conversation. But I was not going to pursue it. The door was not closed. But I was not going to manage her feelings about having been caught. The estate documents remained as they were. Patricia added the competency clause language. The trust for Lily was solidified. The deed was unchanged. My annual cognitive evaluation remained on the calendar. None of these things were dramatic. None of them felt like victory in the moment. They felt like maintenance, like keeping in good order things that had always been in good order. That is the thing about boundaries that are built on real foundations. They don't require drama to hold. They simply need to be clear.
I sent Lily a card that week.
Nothing that mentioned any of what had happened. She was 11 and she didn't need to carry it. The card had a small watercolor of a library on the front. Inside I wrote, "You already know the difference between things that look valuable and things that are.
Keep knowing that.
It will serve you well." She called me to say she'd put it in her book bag. That was enough. The weeks after a truth-telling are always quieter than people expect them to be. There is no dramatic aftermath, no cascading confrontation, no moment where the universe issues a verdict. There is just the ordinary continuation of days, and within those days, the slow revelation of which things have changed and which things have not. Serena did not apologize. I had not expected her to, not quickly. She is a person who has built her entire sense of self around never being visibly in the wrong, and the meeting at Renata's house had placed her visibly in the wrong in front of her husband, her mother-in-law, and her sister-in-law simultaneously. That is not something a person like Serena processes quickly or gracefully. She withdrew instead. She became formally polite with me at the few occasions where we were in the same space. She stopped making suggestions about my house or my health. She did not look at me with open hostility. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has recalculated and is determining next steps.
I did not find that threatening.
I found it legible. She was still Serena, but she now understood that I was also still me, and that the me she had underestimated was documented, legally protected, and not going to be moved. Daniel changed more than I had allowed myself to hope for. Not completely. He still avoids conflict in the instinctive way that some personalities do, the way some people flinch at loud noises even when they know the source is harmless. That is not going to fully resolve.
But there were new things.
He came to my house on a Saturday in April without calling ahead, which he had not done since Arthur died, and he fixed the latch on the back gate that had been sticking since November. He did not announce that he was doing it or ask me to acknowledge it. He just did it, and then we had lunch. He came again in May. We sat on the porch, and I showed him the azaleas, which had come up beautifully, a full stand of them along the south fence, coral-colored, the ones Arthur had planted in 1998. Daniel looked at them for a long time. He said Dad loved those. He did, I said. I should know more, he said. About the house. About what Dad set up. About all of it. I'll walk you through it whenever you want, I said. This weekend? This weekend, I said. We spent 3 hours going through the documents together. I showed him the cedar box. I showed him the trust structure, the deed annotation, the documents Patricia had prepared. He asked careful questions, and I answered them without editorializing. At the end, he sat back in his chair, and he said, he thought of everything.
He was an engineer, I said.
He smiled.
He was.
Then, I should have been paying attention.
Yes, I said.
But you're paying attention now. That is where I left it. I am not interested in extended cycles of guilt and reassurance. He made a mistake. He is correcting it. That is the most I can ask of anyone. Lily continued her Saturday visits throughout the spring. She is working through a series of books about women scientists, which I selected for her: Marie Curie, Rosalind Franklin, Katherine Johnson. She reads about them and then asks me questions about why some of them weren't recognized during their lifetimes. I tell her the truth, because the people around them had decided what was possible before looking carefully at what was actual. She thinks about this in the way she thinks about everything, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. She asked me once, sitting at my kitchen table eating an almond crescent, Grandma Marge, do you get sad about things that happen with Dad and Serena? I considered how to answer honestly without burdening her. Sometimes, I said. But I also know that the things that matter, you, this house, your grandfather's plans for your future, are protected. So the sadness doesn't last very long.
She thought about that.
Then she said, the cedar box. She had seen it once, briefly, on my dresser. I had not explained it to her. Yes, I said. The cedar box. She nodded as if this made complete sense, which perhaps to her it did. Children understand containers for important things more intuitively than adults, I think. They haven't yet learned to distrust significance. I carried the box back to the bedroom shelf after our conversation. I ran my thumb over the brass latch. I thought about a spring afternoon in the garage, and sawdust, and the smell of cedar, and a man who was not mourning his own ending but building something to outlast it. The azaleas bloomed through June. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of this. I'm not sure learned is the right word. I think confirmed is closer. I confirmed things I had always suspected about how worth works, about how it is measured, and by whom, and how badly those measurements can go wrong when the meter is made of fear and ambition, and the need to be seen as significant. Serena saw a house. She saw square footage and neighborhood values and a legal structure she wanted to reroute in her direction. She saw an old woman with white hair and arthritis who made things with her hands, who moved slowly and spoke softly and seemed like someone whose story was already essentially concluded. She saw all of that, and she thought she understood what she was looking at. She didn't see the cedar box. She didn't see the man who built it. She didn't see the 44 years of marriage inside it, or the engineer's precision in every document it held, or the love that had sat down in a garage in 2019, knowing it was dying, and decided to build something instead of something else, and jointed the corners by hand, and burned 2 initials into the lid.
She didn't see any of that.
And that is not my tragedy. That is hers. Arthur used to say that the things built quietly in love outlast the things built loudly for show.
He built a house that way.
He built a marriage that way.
He built a cedar box that way.
I keep it on my nightstand now, not on the shelf. I don't always open it, but I like knowing it's there. I like the fact that on any given morning I can reach out and touch something that was made for me by someone who understood completely what I was worth. You don't need anyone to recognize your value for it to be real. You need a clear record, a good attorney, and someone in your corner who loved you well enough to plan ahead. If you have one of those 3, you have a foundation. If you have all 3, well, then you have a cedar box. And you open it when it's time.